This morning, I want to talk to you about something that I think is very important. And in fact, I think it's so important that personally, I think we could do away with a lot of other parts of the service as long as this part gets the significance that it deserves. And I want you to turn with me to 1 Corinthians chapter 11. And we're going to find in the letter that Paul writes to the Corinthian church that this observance in a very short period of time had become something that they were failing to properly commemorate. And when I look at this passage and when I think through it and when I try to figure out what it is about the early church that made them so forgetful about this, it kind of blows my mind. Less than 100 years after Jesus went to the cross, after he instituted the Lord's Supper, the church already in this very first verse, in verse 17, Paul says, in the following instructions, I do not commend you, because when you come together, it is not for the better, but for the worse. Within 100 years of church tradition, not even, probably closer to 50, maybe 60, within that short period of time, the church has gone from observing the Lord's Supper in a way that brings glory and honor to God to a way that Paul has to write a letter to them and explain why they're not doing it right. Can you imagine what was going on in this church? If you've read the book of 1 Corinthians, you know this church had a lot of problems. And you would have thought that they would have gotten this part right. Let's read the entire passage so we can get an understanding. 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 17 through 29. I'm going to be reading from the English Standard Version. That's what's up on your screen. You may have a different version. It may sound slightly different, but you should get the idea. He says again in verse 17, but in the following instructions, I do not commend you, because when you come together, it is not for the better, but for the worse. For in the first place, when you come together as a church, I hear that there are divisions among you, and I believe it in part, for there must be factions among you in order that those who are genuine among you may be recognized. When you come together, it is not the Lord's Supper that you eat. For in eating, each one goes ahead with his own meal. One goes hungry, another gets drunk. What? Do you not have houses to eat and drink in? Or do you despise the church of God and humiliate those who have nothing? What shall I say to you? Shall I commend you in this? No, I will not. For I received from the Lord what I also delivered to you, that the Lord Jesus, on the night when he was betrayed, took bread. And when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, this is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me. And in the same way also he took the cup after supper, saying, this cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. For as often as you eat this bread and drink the cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. Whoever therefore eats the bread or drinks the cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner will be guilty concerning the body and blood of the Lord. Let a person examine himself then, and so eat of the bread and drink of the cup. For anyone who eats and drinks without discerning the body eats and drinks judgment on himself. Now, this is a passage that's been used in communion meditations as long as I've been in church. The funny thing about the Christian church, I've been a part of it my entire time as a Christian. I've not really known any other denomination or any other type of church. It's just what I grew up with. And this passage gets referred to, as far as the communion meditation goes, more often than not. And I used to laugh and joke that the guys that woke up Sunday morning and forgot that they had communion didn't have to worry, because they automatically had a passage that they could go to. They just had to just use this one. But I think it's interesting when I think about the first century church and how they gathered and what they did, that the Lord's Supper had no significance to them. Or at least it seemed not to, because Paul has heard all of these things. And I wonder what happened. How did the church go from proclaiming Jesus wherever they went to all of a sudden gathering around a table, stuffing their faces with bread and drinking wine, and totally forgetting why they were there? What happened? Well, I think in this passage we can see some key things that caused the church to get to this point. Before I go there, I want you to kind of understand the setting, because we're used to, as a modern church, we're used to church being an hour long, maybe an hour and 15 minutes, hour and a half if the fill-in preacher gets a little windy. I hope not, but you never know. I get on my soapbox on a couple of these topics. We might be here a while. But the early church didn't meet for an hour. They met for an extended period of time. So long, in fact, when they met, that they had to have a meal together. And so when we take the Lord's Supper now, we take a little bitty cracker and we take a little cup of juice and that's it. But that doesn't fill us up for the rest of the service, right? They had a full-on house meal that they participated in each time they gathered together. Because remember, the church didn't always have the opportunity to meet in a nice building like this. They were often meeting in people's homes under the cover of darkness, hiding out from the authorities because they didn't want to be caught. And so they took advantage of the time that they had together. And so I think it's interesting that Paul says that some go ahead and get their fill and get drunk while others go hungry. That makes sense to me because the church centered itself around a meal. It would be like us serving a potluck meal or meal after church if we served it during church and everybody just gobbled down everything that was in front of them, and then when other people got up to get ready to eat because they hadn't been hungry at the time, there was no food left. Now, if you've ever gotten sidetracked at a Mac and been the third to last person in line, I can tell you there's not always a lot of stuff left. And that's okay. But it's the same concept. But the bread and the cup that they had set aside for the Lord's Supper just got wrapped up in that meal. And I think it's amazing how insignificant it became to them in such a short period of time. The first thing that I notice here that Paul points out in this passage that was wrong with the church, he says there are divisions among you. Now, I know that today that's very easy to see because you can drive on any street in Hernando and you can see every possible denomination of church that's out there, and some you've probably never even heard of. You have United Methodist, you have First Presbyterian, you have Baptist, you have Catholic, you have all of these other churches. And we call those divisions today because we think of ourselves as the church. And as long as Jesus is the center of that church, then it really shouldn't matter what the name on the building says, right? That's not always the case, unfortunately. But within the Corinthian church, within this church that Paul is talking about, he says that there are divisions within the individual body of Christ. The individual church that had gathered together, that had huddled in this room together with a common purpose, with a common vision, with a common ideal, had divisions. If you go back to the first chapter of 1 Corinthians, you see that Paul already talks to them about these divisions. He says that one believes that Paul is their leader, the one who brought them salvations. Others say it was Peter. Some say it was Apollos. Other people are very strict and dogmatic and say, no, it was Jesus that brought me to this, nobody else. And so there were divisions about that. There were divisions in the church about which gifts and talents were more important than any other. And so Paul has to talk to them about being a body that operates as one. This church had a real problem with being divided. And I have seen division at work in churches. And it is not pretty. I hope and I pray that none of you have seen some of the things that go on in churches that cause divisions, that cause one group of people to not associate with another group of people because they believe that the minister, when he walks out of church on Sunday, should walk down the center aisle instead of one of the side aisles. Or a board meeting that lasts for hours and hours and hours because they can't decide what color carpet they need to put in the sanctuary. And I'm not even talking about the important stuff like music and leadership and who should do what. Music's not that important either, by the way. These are the kind of things that cause division. My aunt's played the organ for 50 years. Now, granted, she only plays one speed, and that's slow, and she gets lost sometimes, but we can't let anybody else sit at the organ. And dare you bring up, you know what I mean? These are the kind of things that go on in churches all the time. But it's even worse than that. Because if there's a group of people sitting in the church that don't like the preacher, don't like the elders, don't like the deacons, don't like the direction the church is going in, then you start to get those very same divisions. And all of a sudden, you have completely lost your focus on what it is the church is trying to accomplish. When the church tries to go in 6 different directions and doesn't follow its mission, it doesn't accomplish anything. It becomes a gathering place for people to look nice and show off and be around people that are like them. Now, this is very dangerous. And it's obvious in a short period of time here that the Corinthian church has gotten so divided on things that they've lost their way. They've lost their direction. They don't even know what to do. And so it makes sense to me that if they're already divided on the big things or the little things or anything and everything, then the meal that they set aside for the Lord's Supper suddenly becomes something that they're going to argue about. Should we have 1 loaf of bread or 2? What if somebody has a cold? We don't want them touching our bread. Maybe we should have one just for them. Do we all drink out of 1 cup? Do we have little cups? Do we pass it around? Do we let people take it whenever they want to? Do we have one person hold it and everybody comes forward and takes it together? We've lost it. Folks, we've lost the significance of what that meal is. We've boiled it down to a cracker and a cup of juice, but we make it way more difficult than it should be. I told you that I was going to get a little bit excited about this. Now, as a church, if we want to avoid this, you have to be willing to put yourself to the side. You have to be willing to sacrifice your ideas, your thoughts, your convictions on certain things. You have to be willing to put them aside. Isn't that what Jesus called to be in the first place? He called us to not be selfish. He called us to be sacrificial as followers of His. We're supposed to give up what we think is the right thing to do if it means following what He wants us to do. We have to be willing to say, I don't like the black carpet on the stage, but I'm going to let that go. This should be red, by the way. That's my opinion. There are only 2 acceptable colors of church carpet, by the way. I hope you all know what they are. 1 is red, which is right. 2 is blue. Thank you. Only 2 acceptable colors. You bring a color swatch of anything else to a church board meeting, and you can just see the hairs on the back of their people's necks stand up. I tell this story a lot. I'm going to tell it again. You probably heard me tell it 1,000 times, but that's okay. I was at a church. I was a youth minister. At the time they were building, I wasn't the youth minister. I was involved with the youth, but I had to go listen to a lot of this stuff. And the old part of the building had blue carpet, and they were doing an addition of a new sanctuary. They actually had to decide whether they should continue with the blue carpet or if they should have red carpet. And some people didn't want to tear out the blue carpet in the old building and make it all one color. And some people didn't want blue in the new sanctuary because it wouldn't look right. And so do you know what they did? There was a cutoff right where the two buildings met. Do you know what that looked like? Blue carpet here, up, red carpet from here out. It's the most ridiculous thing I've ever seen in my life. They couldn't come to a decision, so the only two acceptable colors to have in church, they just settled on both of them. I guess that's a compromise, but do you really have to argue over what color is right and wrong? We have to be willing to focus on the mission. If we're not focused on the mission, we're going to lose everything. We're not going to attract new people because they're going to see us arguing over all kinds of things. We're not going to be an influence in the community. In fact, we're going to be the church that nobody wants to go to because they think the color of the carpet has to be red. I keep using that one. I apologize. I'm going to get off of that one for just a minute. The next thing that you see here is that Paul says that the Lord's Supper had become just another part of the meal. It had become just another snack to fill their stomachs until they could go home. So some people ate a lot. Some people drank all the wine. Some people didn't get any. Which again, it just amazes me. How do you decide that the bread that's been set aside for... Anyway, I'm not going to go there. It amazes me that they had such a desire for themselves that they didn't even notice what they were doing, it seems like. And for Paul to have to call them out on it, can you imagine? I want you to put yourselves in the shoes of the Corinthian church. You're all sitting in a room, you're gathered around. Somebody gets up and says, I've got a letter from Paul I'm going to read to everybody. And everybody gets all excited because Paul, they look at each other and they think, oh, we're doing so good. We have all these people in the room. We're doing everything right. And then Paul just lays into them. And they get to this part and by now they're just, what's he going to do next? What next? And he comes to the Lord's Supper and all of a sudden he just lays this bomb on them. You can't even do this right. It is not just a cracker and a cup of juice. It is not just a loaf of bread and a glass of wine. It is so much more than that. He says that they're selfish. He says that they're guilty of not sharing. He says they're guilty of going ahead of other people. He says they're guilty of taking advantage of the hospitality of people that have made this meal for them in the first place. Notice what he says. Don't you have homes to eat and drink in? Why would you come to church hungry and then eat everything in front of you? Can't you eat at home before you come? If you're that hungry, can't you make sure that everybody has something? I wonder if it was the same way with the rest of the meal. I wonder if there were groups in the church that made sure they got there a little bit early so they could sample the food before everybody got there. So that when people got there later, there wasn't anything to eat. And maybe those people that came later, they were expecting that to be there because that may have been their only meal for the day. See, They didn't have, we all know this, they didn't have the luxury of having microwave ovens and frozen meals to go home to after church and pop in the microwave because they didn't like what was being served. They had to eat. They had to take time to prepare that meal. They couldn't go home after church and make a meal. They just didn't have the time. So for some people, that was their meal for the day. Can you imagine how that would feel? Seems like a very selfish place to be. And the last one, and probably the most important reason that they failed at this, is they forgot the purpose. They absolutely, totally, 100% missed the mark on what it was they were celebrating in the first place. Less than 100 years after Jesus had walked to Calvary with that crossbeam on his back and had been nailed to that cross and shed his blood and died for them and rose on the third day and proclaimed who he was, they had forgotten why they were there. I don't understand it. I wish I could explain it. I wish I could tell you, well, they were busy. Well, they had soccer practice. Well, their kids are out doing this or that. Well, they didn't sleep good the night before. Maybe they were on guard duty. I don't get it. How do you come together with the exact purpose of commemorating Jesus' death on the cross and forget it? How do you do it? Is it a willful thing? Is it intentional? Do you just decide you're not going to celebrate it? Do you just decide you're not going to recognize it? I don't know. He has to go back and tell them about the night that Jesus gathered with the disciples around the table when he took the bread and he shared it with them and he told them that this was not just an ordinary piece of bread gathered around an ordinary meal, that bread was his body that was about to be broken and crushed and beaten and tortured. That was his body that he was giving for them so that they could have something to look forward to. And that the cup that he passed them after the meal was not just some ordinary cup of wine or juice or whatever. It was his blood that he was going to shed on that cross, that he was going to willingly allow to be poured out so that it could be the only sacrifice that needed to be made for sin. That it could tear the curtain inside the temple in two from top to bottom so that no longer was man separated from the presence of God. That he was going to lay down his body and create a bridge between us and God that had never been available before. And Paul says, when you gather around this table, you proclaim his death until he returns. You've heard John say it, the cradle is useless without the cross is useless without the empty tomb. We have to proclaim what he's done for us. And if we don't take this meal seriously, if we don't make it a central part of who we are and what we do at any given time, then we lose that. We lose how important it is, not just to us, but to the world. Because if it's not important to you right now, it's not important enough for you to go out and tell somebody else about it. If it loses its significance in here, it absolutely loses its significance out there. And now we're just people running around proclaiming we think we know somebody that might do something good for you. because we've lost the significance of the table. We rush this meal, folks. We still do it today. It amazes me. I used to sit back at that computer from time to time. There are and I've said this before, y'all have heard me say this, I'm going to say it again. There are 3 minutes allowed in the service for communion, and that is not a knock on Chad. That's how long it takes y'all to take communion. It's got 3 minutes because that's all the longer it takes. And so to avoid a bunch of dead space, we've just said, okay, it's going to be 3 minutes because that's the way you guys take it. That's not a knock on how we program things. That's a knock on us, on how little importance it gives to us. And I'm going to be the first one to say, I will admit it, I have been just as guilty of this as anybody else. I have taken this, barring the times I have not been at church, I have taken this every Sunday for as long as I can remember, 30 some odd years. I hate saying that, by the way. There have been times that it's lost its significance. There have been times that when it was passed to me, I just took it and passed it on. There have been times that I've been guilty of getting up from where I'm sitting and just going to the table and taking it and forgetting all about it. It happens. But it shouldn't. They had lost their way. I understand what happens to me when I do it because it's very personal for me. When I do it, I know why I do it. It doesn't make it right. It absolutely makes it wrong. It shouldn't be something that I do, but I know when I do it, I know I do it. They were doing it and not even recognizing that they were doing it. And so Paul has to tell them, and I'm going to end with this, he has to tell them that you have to examine yourself before you take the bread and drink the cup, or else you are eating and drinking judgment on yourself. That is a harsh statement to have to hear. If you do not take the time to give it its significance, to give it its purpose, to give it its meaning, it loses everything. It loses everything for you personally. It loses everything for anybody you would ever come into contact with. It loses everything, quite possibly, forever. And that is not something I want for anybody. And so I'm going to encourage you to make us go late today. As we get ready to take communion this morning, I am going to encourage you, let's push past 3 minutes. Let's make somebody look around and see if everybody's fallen asleep. I don't know. Let's make it matter. Because we could gather together every Sunday and never take it. Or we can gather together every Sunday and make it the most important thing we do.